Great, we'll get started. Thanks everyone for coming. We have more people trickling in. This is a timely moment to be discussing energy and Russia. And so I appreciate everyone coming out to join us today, and I know there's lots of people watching online as well. My name is Jason Bordoff. I'm a faculty member here at the School of International Public Affairs. I direct the Center on Global Energy Policy, and I'm really delighted that James Henderson was able to visit with us today to discuss the impact that sanctions are having on Russia. I suspect we'll also talk a bit about the recent decision on the South Stream pipeline, about the drop in oil prices and what that means for Russia, and how sanctions fit into all of that. So a lot of timely stuff to talk about. Many of you know James. He's a senior research fellow at the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies, and he's been analyzing the Russian oil and gas industry for about the past 2 decades, both in the private sector as head of energy at Wood Mac, was in Moscow as head of oil and gas research for Renaissance Capital, and then came back to the UK to be head of Russia at Lambert Energy Advisory, the firm founded and run by Philip Lambert, and then became a senior research fellow at the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies, which, as you all know, does some of the very best work out there looking at global oil and gas issues. Adrien Lejeune, a fellow here at the center now, has been closely involved as chair of their board at the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies for a long time. So really glad that you could be here today to talk with us, share your perspectives on what's happening in Russia today, and we'll sort of have a conversation and then open it up to questions. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Henderson.
Thanks, Jason. Good afternoon. Interesting time to be talking about Russia, and a lot more to talk about than sanctions. I'm going to try and speak for around 20 minutes, not overrun too much. There's plenty of time for discussion, which will be the more interesting part, I suspect. But I'll just start with a quick overview of the sanctions as they currently stand. As I'm sure many of you know, both the US and the EU have imposed sanctions on various companies in Russia and on various issues on the technological front, looking at banning technology transfer and operations in the Arctic, deep water below 500 feet, and shale oil development, and importantly, I think probably more importantly, financial restrictions on various companies and maturity of debt that they can raise, with the US restriction on energy companies being holding them back to a 90-day maturity, and in the EU it happens to be 30 days, and affecting companies such as Transneft, Rosneft, Novatek in particular, and to an extent Gazprom as well. However, I think the point I want to make about sanctions is not just their physical impact, which I'm going to talk about, but also more the psychological impact on companies operating in Russia and companies transacting with Russia. I've noted at the bottom there are 4 other countries that have, in their own ways, gone along with the sanctions concept, but actually in other ways transactions have been slowed down and businesses being undermined. One example that springs to mind is Rosneft oil sales to Japan out of the Far Eastern port of Kosmino Bay, where banks essentially wouldn't finance Japanese purchases of Russian crude, despite the fact that that's not sanctioned. Banks were so concerned about being involved with oil trade with Russia that essentially Japanese trading companies couldn't raise finance to buy the crude. So it's that kind of psychological impact, and obviously, as I'll talk about later, it's also the inability of Russian companies to raise finance for major projects. So I think that's really the key problem, I think, that the Russian companies have in the short term. In terms of oil production, Russian oil production's been at a tipping point for a few years, and the Russian government has attempted to address the issue of whether production can be maintained above 10 million barrels a day in a number of ways. That figure is important not just as a point of prestige for Russia, but also because the oil sector, and particularly oil exports, contributes so much to the Russian economy. So essentially 45% of budget revenues come from the taxation on oil exports, and so clearly a decline in the oil price, which we'll discuss, but also a decline in physical output can have a significant impact on what the Russian government can earn. The hydrocarbon sectors also account for about 20% or more of GDP, and about 70% of Russia's overall export revenues. So it's a key part of the Russian economy. For the past couple of years, there's been a concern, as I've said, about where production is going to go, and this graph just shows a couple of forecasts from the Energy Ministry in their general scheme of the development of the oil industry, and you can see that in their most pessimistic case, oil production by 2030 could effectively have halved. That pessimistic case assumed no change in the tax system in Russia, which is pretty penal, very high rate of marginal tax, export tax and royalty. With some tax changes, you can see the grey dotted line anticipated kind of flat production to 2020 and then a possible decline. Interestingly, the EIA have been more bullish, and there's a kind of growing line from about 10.5 to 11 million barrels a day. But that growth, and indeed kind of even maintaining production flat, does require essentially a shift away from the core areas where Russian oil has been produced historically in West Siberia and European Russia towards new greenfield areas, East Siberia, tight oil, shale oil, offshore, and the Arctic. And of course, three of those things, as you already have noticed, are areas that have been sanctioned by the US and the EU. So clearly an attempt to target Russia's long-term growth potential. Now, in the short term, there's clearly an issue of whether production can be maintained through investment in the existing fields, enhanced oil recovery, and in the short-term development of other satellite fields that are being discovered. I think my overall conclusions, I'll come to at the end, is that in the short term, Russian production probably can stay flat, but beyond about 2016, we may start to run into trouble and see production go into decline. But more of that later. In terms of the oil price, I just thought I'd stick in these three graphs because I think they're fairly instructive. The correlation between the oil price and Russian real GDP is fairly extraordinary. The R squared is about 0.9. So essentially, when you're forecasting Russian economic growth, you need to be able to forecast the oil price. Interesting, I was a stock analyst for a while back in Russia, and I spent many, many hours with intimate company models trying to work out profitability and cash flows. And actually, as the graph at the bottom shows, all I really needed to do again to forecast where the Russian stock market was going was to forecast the oil price, because again, the correlation is very stark. The interesting graph, perhaps, though, is that when you look at oil production, which is the graph in the top left, and you can see that, again, there is a fairly close connection, as one might expect, and that graph goes all the way back to the Soviet era in 1965. There's a fairly close connection, but with a lag. And again, perhaps not a surprise to see that lag, and I think it re-emphasizes the fact that, in the short term, the reaction to the oil price fall may not be as catastrophic as one might have thought. One of the reasons for that is that the ruble exchange rate tends to react very fast to a decline or an increase in the oil price. And obviously we've seen the ruble collapse from 35 to the dollar to 53, 54 to the dollar today. And that collapse has essentially offset the decline in the oil price. 100% of lifting costs, 90% of capital costs in the Russian oil sector are ruble-based. So in dollar terms, they're obviously coming down. And the collapse in the ruble has also allowed the Russian government in the short term to offset the impact on budget revenues. So the budget deficit will not be as badly hit as one might have thought. Over time, ruble inflation, which is rising and could hit 11% in the end of the second quarter next year, will eventually erode that benefit. But for the short term at least, one would expect a lag in oil production decline rather than an immediate impact. In terms of the more specific areas where sanctions have hit, the Russian Arctic has very, very significant reserves. I happen to work on the BP transaction where they wanted to buy into Rosneft and do what ExxonMobil are doing in the Arctic, and I can tell you that some of those licenses that Rosneft have picked up in the Kara Sea are some of the most prospective exploration licenses in the world. The first well that's been drilled there is on a prospect that could contain up to 9 billion barrels of oil. So it's a pretty exciting oil area, but I think in the short term, for Russia, the real interest was as much political as commercial, establishing Russia's position in emerging trade routes through the northern seas as the ice melts, establishing a position, a useful military position, and an increasingly technologically developed position in the northern regions of Russia, which to date have been largely underpopulated for obvious reasons. So there were lots of political reasons why Russia was interested in the Arctic, as well as the very long-term oil production potential. You can see that from the pie chart, Russia contains more than half of the estimated resources in the Arctic. That was obviously the attraction for the international oil companies, and so keen were they that effectively they had all agreed, Statoil, ENI, ExxonMobil, to finance all of the initial exploration that Rosneft was going to undertake. Now, the sanctions essentially have, I would say, indefinitely postponed Russia's development of the Arctic. Exxon, as I'm sure you know, was forced to walk away just as the discovery on its first license was announced. From what I read and understand from talking to people in Moscow, service contracts have been cancelled, drilling rigs, the drilling rig used in the first well has been reallocated, and it's pretty inconceivable that Rosneft could go back on its own or with a potential partner from China, because it just doesn't have the experience and the expertise and access to the service companies to allow it to go back safely and drill. So I think, despite the initial success, sanctions have clearly impacted Russia's ability to deal in the Arctic. But in the short term, that's really kind of irrelevant. We weren't looking at significant production before 2030 in any case. And one could almost argue that actually, in a Russian context, it's better that Rosneft refocuses its attention on more immediate issues. More immediate issues were also tight oil, where Rosneft had, and others had, JVs with the likes of Exxon, Statoil, BP, Lukoil were working with Total, and Shell were working with Gazprom Neft. You know, it's interesting because the Bazhenov Shale, which is the one that many people are focused on, is the biggest resource, shale oil resource in the world, as identified by the United States Geological Survey. It covers a vast chunk of West Siberia. It essentially sits underneath all the West Siberian existing fields. So the infrastructure is in place, and the expectations for production had been very significant. You know, anything from 500,000 to 1.5 million barrels a day by the next decade. And as the graph at the beginning showed, it's one of the major potential resources that Russia could have tapped into to flatten out that production profile as the existing fields went into decline. Now, I think the potential has been pushed back significantly. There were already issues with how fast it could realistically be developed, given the governance structures and the availability of service industry to meet the demands for drilling rigs. I think now that Western service companies have been forced to pull out, we're talking at least a 5-year delay in the development of tight oil in Russia, unless sanctions are overturned. So I think these numbers are being pushed out, and the impact of tight oil in Russia is now sort of looking like more towards the end of the next decade, rather than by 2020, 2025. So I think, again, a significant problem, one that Russia is trying to address by building up its own service companies. Rosneft has certainly claimed that within 5 years there could be 100% import substitution of services that had originally been bought from Western companies. I mean, I think that's an optimistic estimate. Certainly from what I hear, 95% of horizontal wells drilled in Russia are still being drilled with Western equipment. So it's certainly a big ask to move away to a domestic-focused industry. In the long term, yes, but again, certainly not something we're going to see pre-2020. The interesting thing is that as a result of the sanctions, the focus now must be more on getting back to basics of working on existing fields in the core areas and exploiting as best as possible the brown fields using increasing amounts of enhanced oil recovery. Again, this does involve Western contractors, and there is confusion, certainly in the operators in Moscow, as to what technology can and can't be provided to the Russian oil industry, given where we are on sanctions. Obviously, some of the kit that's used in the shale for horizontal drilling and fracking is also used in traditional fields, and there has been a reluctance in Western contractors to provide any equipment that could be seen as shale equipment for any operations at all. Actually, that situation is gradually being clarified, so it looks like they are going to be able to provide that kit. So it's certainly possible that a refocus on the brown fields and the development of satellite fields that have already been identified close to the existing infrastructure, again, can help to redress some of the loss of the tight oil potential in particular. Again, a kind of conclusion from sanctions that, if you like, Russia is being forced, and Russian companies are being forced to focus on their knitting, if you like, to focus on the things they've traditionally been good at and exploit them to the max, rather than suddenly focus on areas that are of interest to Western companies, actually, because that's where their expertise is most relevant. So a refocus on the brown fields, I think, is what we're going to see. This slide just kind of emphasizes that Russia's biggest and state-controlled company, Rosneft, does face financial issues, and I think, as I've mentioned at the beginning, that's the key to the future of Russian oil production, is how can these financial issues be addressed. Russia as a whole has about $700 billion of external debt, of which about $75 billion is held by the sovereign and the rest is private sector. Rosneft itself has about $65 billion of debt, half of which needs to be repaid in 2 years. So addressing that issue is a big issue and may well cause Rosneft to cut back capex. Help from the state is potentially available. Central bank reserves are $400 billion, but more relevantly, the National Welfare Fund, the National Wealth Fund, has about $85 billion available, and Rosneft and others have applied for that money to use to help sort out some of the financial issues and to invest in new projects. We'll see how that gets allocated, but nevertheless, the financing question is a testing one, and I suspect it'll lead to Rosneft production potentially going into decline in 2014. But over the longer term, a key question for the Russian oil industry is when will it be able to access capital markets again? The current forecast from the Ministry of Economic Development is 2016, 2017. I mean, given that's a Russian estimate, it's probably quite optimistic. So this is one of the big challenges for the Russian oil companies. As the Russian oil companies have to prioritize, which may well be a good thing, one of the things they may have to address is their ambitions in the gas sector. And I think the gas sector is another interesting example of how developments that had been occurring in the Russian industry have been stalled, and we've kind of reverted to where we were 5 years ago. The pictures here show you what was happening up to really the end of 2013, which is that we were seeing a fundamental shift in the Russian gas sector away from Gazprom and toward other independent, if I can call them that, producers, Novatek, Rosneft, and others. And you can see the long-term trend in Gazprom's production was down, and the long-term trend very, very much was an increase. And that was to do with the competitiveness of Gazprom, which was diminishing as it developed new, more expensive fields, and the ability of third parties to actually find customers initially in Russia, and then, as of the end of last year, even in LNG export markets, as exports were finally liberalized for liquefied natural gas, not for pipeline gas. So we were seeing a situation where Gazprom was facing challenges domestically and across all its markets, and was having to react by reining in production. The outlook in the domestic market is for pretty stagnant demand growth and loss of market share from Gazprom. And the same story was playing out to an extent in Europe, but I think the political situation, obviously around Ukraine, and issues around European energy demand, and particularly gas demand and how it's supplied, have really come to the fore over the past 6 months, as we've seen a real sort of question within the EU particularly as to how they react to Russian gas. Europe has a problem which has been euphemistically called its trilemma of balancing environmental targets, which we've seen have been reinforced in the last month, with energy security, which has clearly been highlighted by issues over potential Ukraine pipelines going down and 50% of Russian exports essentially not being available, possibly over the winter, with the cost of energy supply. So Gazprom has been largely exempted from sanctions because Europe's been so worried about not receiving Russian gas. But in future, certainly the European Commission is keen to see Russian gas diversified away from the European energy mix. The problem with that strategy is that it's not felt by all members of the EU, and it also flies against both the environmental targets that Europe has and the energy cost necessity of buying cheaper energy in an economy that is stagnating. The bottom line is that if you want to meet your environmental targets, you have to use more gas and displace coal. If you want to buy more gas in Europe, you have no choice but to buy more Russian gas, really, because the alternative sources of supply are very limited and indigenous production is going into decline. And if there's any competition for the gas market, it's just a fact that Russia has the cheapest gas available, bar none, for the European market. And the graph on the right attempts to show that. What I do is compare the oil-linked Russia gas price in 2013, which was about $11 an MMBTU, with the spot price in Europe for the first 9 months of 2014, which was about $8.50, with a notional US LNG price exported to Europe with a Henry Hub price of $5, which would be about $10.50, and obviously a buck lower at $4 Henry Hub. And that compares with a marginal cost of Russian supply into Europe of about $5 an MMBTU, and a full cycle cost of the most expensive development in Russia on the Yamal Peninsula of about $7.50. So you can see that if Russia decided to compete, it could. I'm not saying that it will, but it could. And so Europe is faced with this dilemma of how to treat Russian gas. And that dilemma was really best exemplified by the issues over South Stream, where Russia has attempted to argue that the Ukraine issue does not highlight a problem of security of supply from Russia. It highlights a problem of security of transit through Ukraine. And their solution to that problem was to build an alternative pipeline bypassing Ukraine. And the problem that we've faced is that that pipeline, to meet European regulations, would need to offer third-party access onshore Europe, and various intergovernmental agreements that Russia had made with Bulgaria, Serbia, Hungary and Austria would need to have been unwound, and there was a significant risk that Russia would build the pipeline and then not be able to transport the gas across mainland Europe. So the interesting debate that's been had within the EU is that the countries of Southeast Europe, which are most exposed to Ukraine transit risk, have been very keen, actually, to see this pipeline go ahead and to buy Russian gas through it. Many other EU members and the EU Commission have been much more reluctant and have seen South Stream as a threat of being surrounded again by Russian gas, and have essentially blocked discussion of exempting South Stream from third energy package rules. The consequence, which we've seen in the past few days, has been that Russia has cancelled a project that was something of a white elephant, to be honest. It wasn't going to transport any new gas, it was just going to transport gas and divert around Ukraine, and has instead proposed a new pipeline using perhaps half the existing route to western Turkey, and then on into the European Union, into Greece. And the interesting thing about this change of heart is that, again, the sanctions, the disputes, the political issues with Europe have ultimately, one could argue, pushed Russia and Gazprom towards a more logical commercial outcome. Turkey is the only gas market that's growing in Europe. It is about to receive more gas from Azerbaijan, and essentially Russia is now in a position to defend its market share in Turkey, to potentially increase supplies and to get supplies into Southeast Europe via a different route, which won't ultimately bypass the EU, because obviously it will enter Greece, and then if it goes on up into Italy, it will enter EU countries. But nevertheless, it's saved itself some money. It's put aside a project that could have been a white elephant, and it's now essentially accessing the fastest growing gas market in Europe. So potentially an optimal outcome for Gazprom, pushed on it by the political issues with the EU. The other thing that the debate with the EU has done is clearly to push or to encourage Russia and Gazprom to do again what was clearly the most logical thing for the country to do in any case, and has been evident for the past 10 years, which is to open up the Asian market and diversify its sources of demand. As much as Europe is exposed to Russian gas is exposed to the European market, which is currently stagnating under pressure from increasing renewables production and cheap coal. So the negotiations with China have been ongoing for at least a decade, if not longer, but the catalyst of politics saw a first deal concluded in May for exports of 38 BCM of gas from East Siberia, and there's the possibility in 2015 that we'll see a second deal for another 30 BCM transporting gas from West Siberia, where there is a massive oversupply of gas. There's about 100 BCM of production capacity, so 10 BCF a day of spare production capacity in West Siberia, which could be transported to Western China. And as you can see in the graph on the right, what I've plotted there is, in a worst-case scenario, if the contracts for gas sales into Europe just are left to expire out to 2030 and are not renewed, you can see that the Asian exports of gas would compensate for that decline in their entirety, and indeed would push exports up by the mid-2020s. If European sales remain flat, as is the most likely outcome, again, it's a huge growth opportunity for Russia, which has been catalysed by the need to do a deal to demonstrate to the Europeans and to the US that Russia has alternative markets for its gas. That strategy is also happening in the oil sector, and I guess one risk one would highlight is that as it diversifies away from Europe, Russia is becoming rather exposed to a single buyer in China, and one would question for the longer term whether Russia is particularly comfortable with that increasing exposure, given the very, very strong bargaining position that China has in the energy markets. That's probably an issue to be addressed 5 years from now, but essentially it's a foreign policy issue for Russia. I guess a final point to make in the last bullet is that this shift is not really a threat to Europe, despite the fact that Vladimir Putin would like to say he's diverting gas sales, particularly from Europe to China. In reality, he's not, because, as I've said, there is this massive oversupply of gas in West Siberia. All that's happening is that Russia is essentially selling gas to China that would otherwise have been left in the ground. So there's not really a security of supply risk for Europe, but there's a good opportunity for Russia to diversify. The other trend in the gas sector, interestingly, has been that whereas a year ago, if I'd been giving this talk, I'd have been talking about a massive LNG growth strategy, sanctions have really hit Russia's LNG prospects for two reasons. One, because the two companies that were accelerating the growth fastest, Rosneft and Novatek, are now struggling to raise finance for their projects. Particularly Rosneft is probably not going to do either of the two yellow projects highlighted on this map. And Novatek, I think the Yamal LNG will go ahead, but probably on a slower timetable. The second issue has been a concern that liquefaction technology would be the next thing to be sanctioned, and that's put off Gazprom from committing to a new plant at Vladivostok. And actually a third point is that customers for Russian LNG have essentially stepped back and said, we don't want to buy any while Russia is a country under sanctions, because we can't tell how fast you'll be able to develop these projects, and we need security of supply. So again, a kind of psychological impact of sanctions has particularly encouraged Northeast Asian customers to step back from committing to Russian LNG. So what we've seen is a switch back to pipeline exports. And again, another unintended consequence of sanctions, the competition that Gazprom was facing that I talked about from third parties, particularly from Novatek and Rosneft, has been undermined by sanctions. And what we're seeing is a reversion to type, which is Gazprom taking control of exports to China, which had been under threat, particularly from Rosneft, doing what it knows best, building pipelines, selling pipeline exports, and negotiating long-term contracts with single buyers. And this is good potentially for Gazprom. It's also good for the Russian budget because, as it happens, gas exports via pipeline are taxed at 30%, whereas LNG exports are not taxed at all in terms of export taxes. So there's benefits all round for the Russian government and for Gazprom from this change in strategy, which again has essentially been catalyzed by sanctions. This graph just shows you the possible outlook for Russian sales to Asia. There are mentioned two pipelines so far, the Power of Siberia pipeline, which is the brown stack in the bar chart on the left, and the green is the new western pipeline, the Altai pipeline, which is being negotiated. There's a third pipeline which actually could run from the island of Sakhalin down into northeast China. So you can see that the potential of pipeline sales is pretty significant. LNG is a much smaller part of the chart than you would have seen a year ago. There's an existing LNG export project in Sakhalin which could be expanded, and then there's Yamal LNG. But that's about it, I think, for LNG for now. Perhaps the more interesting graph on this slide, though, is the graph on the right, which shows you the competitive position of Russian gas in Asia. And the two red bars show you the price that's been negotiated for East Siberian gas into China, which was $10 an MMBTU, which equates to about $12.50 on the eastern seaboard of China. And the second red bar shows you the theoretical price that Russian gas could be supplied from West Siberia into Western China and then transported across to the eastern seaboard again, and using a European netback equivalent. And you can see that essentially what this graph tells you is that Russian gas is very competitive both in Europe and in Asia. It can certainly compete with existing pipeline imports from Central Asia, which gives Russia an interesting geopolitical tool in negotiations with its traditional allies, but now competitors. It certainly competes with spot LNG from Qatar and the new oil-linked contracts from Australia, and it's pretty much on a par with US LNG exports, again at a notional $5 Henry Hub price. So you can see that despite the fact that Russia's under pressure, it's got some pretty competitive hydrocarbons to offer both Asia and Europe in the gas sector. One final theme I wanted to mention, because I'm coming towards the end of my time, is that it's an ongoing theme in the Russian oil and gas sector for the past 10 years, really, since Putin has been president or prime minister or president again, has been the consolidation, the reconsolidation of oil and gas production under state control. This graph shows the shift in oil production, and this is the kind of equity share of the state in Russian oil production. You can see from a period in 2000 where essentially the industry had been largely privatized, we're now back at 50-60% being state-owned, state-influenced. And that trend is continuing now as Russia develops this kind of fortress mentality under attack from the West as it sees it. Bashneft is the latest example of a company that has been retaken by the state and will probably be reprivatized to raise money, but the most likely buyer will be Rosneft, I suspect. So we're seeing that trend continue. That's a concern, I think, for Russian oil production because the more state control there is, the less efficient things tend to get. Certainly development of tight oil under a state company is hard to conceive in any way comparable to what's happened in the US, where obviously it's been a much more competitive marketplace. I think that the other thing that we've seen, the interesting trend we had before, was that as the state consolidated control, actually state companies were getting competitive with each other. And we saw Rosneft and Gazprom pretty much at war over gas, access to consumers in Russia, access to export pipelines. They remain in conflict, but the conflict is now pretty much under control, and Putin has banged heads together effectively. And what we're seeing, again, as a result of the pressure, is that Russia is being forced to take some much more rational commercial decisions rather than political decisions, because essentially it can't afford to do anything else if it's going to have an oil and gas industry for the future. So again, interestingly, the theme of consolidation is ongoing. The theme of state companies competing is taking a bit of a back seat, and both Rosneft and Gazprom are being forced to do some more logical commercial things. I think this is my last chart, so I'm going to conclude here by just pointing out, I think, that despite the pressure, undoubted pressure that Russia is under, and one shouldn't belittle the pressure that particularly Russian oil companies are under at the moment and the Russian economy is under. Nevertheless, Russia does sit right at the heart of the global energy economy, and as I've tried to point out, it does have pretty competitive hydrocarbons to offer both, well, the two largest importing regions in the world, namely Europe and Northeast Asia. The heartland of Europe, Gazprom's gas is competitive and it's becoming more commercially sensible in terms of how it prices and offers it gas. Clearly it has political issues. We'll see how they get addressed over time. In the East, the obvious diversification that Russia has been trying to undertake for a decade is now underway. Again, gas particularly, but also oil being offered at competitive prices. So I think, despite the pressure of sanctions, there's at least an argument to say that they forced Russia to take a more rational view of the global energy economy. And we are seeing a situation emerge where, barring catastrophe, we may find that Russia's position and the position of its state companies has actually strengthened in the next 5 years rather than weakened, because finally they've been forced to do things that many of us thought they should have been doing for the last 5 or 10 years. There are two things that could undermine that argument. One is the ongoing financial pressures, which I've mentioned. Gazprom needs to spend $27 billion on one pipeline to China, $18 billion on another. How can it raise that money, given that gas prices are coming down in line with oil prices? Well, Chinese support, I think, will probably be the answer. It's not forthcoming yet, but there's a clear question there. And the second question is whether politics will undermine Russia's commercial advantages. We're already seeing evidence that state companies are being forced to do deals at very, very marginal rates of return. If President Putin decides to use his energy business as a political tool for too long, then that could clearly undermine the commercial arguments for both Gazprom and Rosneft and essentially undermine the businesses of the companies. Those are two risks, clear risks, but despite those, Russia still sits in a pretty strong position relative to the two major energy importing markets in the world. I'll stop there because my time is up and happy to answer some questions.
Thanks very much. We have a little over a half hour for questions, and there's a lot of expertise in this room, so I'll ask one or two just to kind of get it going, but then I really want to make sure we open it up and get a discussion going with everyone here. Just one quick thing to clarify on the last point you made about the low-cost resources they have. When I look at all the analysis coming out of the banks and the kind of energy analysts right now, the discussion is about if we need to pull 1 million or 1.5 million barrels off the day to kind of balance where the market is right now. The debate seems to be whether the swing supplier will be U.S. shale or potentially Russia. So how do we think about the cost of their production now and how much it could be impacted by the falling price? How low is it?
Well, I think the interesting thing about the cost of Russian supply is that the actual lifting cost, even the full cycle exploration and then F&D, finding and development costs and production costs are actually very, very low. They're about $14 a barrel compared to a global average of about $50. So actually the major cost of Russian production is tax. So the average tax on a Russian barrel is about 75%. And obviously, as oil prices fall, essentially Russian companies are sheltered by the fact that their tax bill goes down fairly significantly. So actually, I don't think we're going to see any dramatic short-term impact on Russian production because of low oil prices, because essentially Russian oil companies they're not geared to the upside, but also they're protected on the downside by the high tax rate. So I think that far more important, so for 2015, for example, I'd be surprised if we see any production reaction at all. I think the reaction we'll see is as the ability to raise finance kicks in 2016, 2017, 2018 and beyond. Then if sanctions are still in place and access to capital markets is still very restricted, then I think we'll see an impact.
So absent some change in OPEC course, some potential further downward pressure on prices and U.S. shale might end up being the swing.
Yeah, I think interestingly, relative to OPEC, the one company that is under pressure, I think, significantly is Rosneft because of its financial constraints. It was interesting that Igor Sechin went to meet the Saudi oil minister pre the OPEC meeting from what I understand, there was an offer for Russia cutting 5 million tons of production in return for OPEC cutting kind of 25 or 30 million tons, which was turned down.
What is that in barrels?
Well, that 35 is about 1 million barrels a day. So essentially, what Rosneft were doing was offering what we think will happen anyway, which is a Rosneft decline in production. But I think if you look at the oil sector as a whole in Russia, there are other companies with projects that are coming on stream, have come on stream, or are very close to coming on stream, which will compensate for a decline. And so I think that, again, next year, if we see any decline in Russian oil production, it will be very, very minimal, I think.
So if the decline sort of concentrates the mind and spurs some emergency OPEC action, you think Russia may participate in some?
No, I don't. I think Russia's offered to participate and has done this for many times and has never actually pushed through with a commitment. I think OPEC is rightly cynical of any promises from Russia. I think what would happen is that Rosneft might demonstrate that it would cut production, because I think that might happen anyway. I think other Russian companies might take up the slack, to be honest, if Rosneft does it. I don't think I'd be surprised if there's a government initiative to cut production.
So you gave a really helpful take on what impact sanctions are having today. Can you try to project a little bit and sort of talk a little bit about how you think they're going to play out, not just economically, but geopolitically? Where do you think the sanctions are going to head from this point, and what impact will not just the falling oil price but other factors have on that?
Well, I think, I hesitate to guess if it was another round of sanctions, what would be included. I think from an energy perspective, the most likely thing, if there are further rounds of sanctions coming in, is that liquefaction technology would be hit, would be restricted, because that's something that would undermine the Russian gas sector without undermining sales to Europe. I mean, the only liquefaction there is at the moment is Sakhalin 2. The development of further LNG projects would only have an impact on the global gas market out from 2019, but it would really annoy the Russians not to have access to that technology. So I think that would be one thing. I mean, I guess there's a possibility that there could be further sanctions on horizontal drilling equipment, fracking equipment, for more than just the tight oil. I mean, interestingly, that would have an immediate impact, I think, on Russian oil production, and that might, perversely then obviously see an impact on the oil price. That's a possibility, I think. I mean, in terms of when and if they'll be introduced, I guess we'll see what happens in Ukraine this winter.
Yeah, what do you think will happen with are we going to see another gas crisis emerge in the Ukraine this winter? Is that in Putin's interest or not?
Well, I think the South Stream decision is an interesting one, because it offers Putin a very nice kind of political argument if there is a crisis in Ukraine this winter. I'm not saying he'll definitively catalyse one, but if the gas got cut off and there's no South Stream coming through, he can turn around and go, right, well, I tried to offer you a solution, but you didn't want it, and now look where you are. And I think essentially the South Stream decision has allowed Putin to pass the Ukraine transit issue completely into European hands. Say, right, this is your problem now, guys. And I think what we'll see is Russia play Ukraine sales and transit absolutely by the book. There will be no gas sold to Ukraine until money is paid. The money will have to come from the EU or the IMF. If the money's not forthcoming, the gas will be cut off, and that's your problem, not mine. And I've tried to offer you a solution. If you don't want my solution, fine, you deal with the problem. And I think, so therefore, I think a Ukraine crisis would be a useful kind of grist to that mill, if you like, over the winter. And it may be, if the geopolitical situation gets worse, that it could be catalysed. I mean, there are always debates about whether gas is being siphoned off, whether what was put into the system reaches the European market at the other end. It's not inconceivable that, a situation could be manufactured where it looks like Ukraine is stealing the gas. Alternatively, it may actually start to steal the gas. I mean, that it may. I don't think it's going to happen in the short term because there's gas in storage, but certainly if there's a cold winter, then by January, February, it's not inconceivable there could be a crisis. And that would be...
So I can't tell from your answer if you think, in Russia's mind, South Stream is really done or not.
I think... no, I don't think South Stream is completely done. I think there is... I think what Putin has done is has left the option for the EU to change its mind, which I think is incredibly unlikely. So I think and I think Russia understands that too. I think where we've left South Stream is it could still go ahead if you essentially allow us to transport gas through Europe in a way that we have always wanted to do with our intergovernmental agreements. However, if you continue to object and you continue to stand in the way, we now have this alternative, which we will pursue. So I think that, on balance, it's 90% dead, but there's a window of opportunity. If a gas crisis in Ukraine this winter suddenly caused a change of heart in Europe, then I think Russia could go back to South Stream.
So we have microphones here. Let's, if people could come up to the microphone if they have a question. I think that's how we're working. Is that right, Ka? Yep. If you could identify yourself, ask a brief question. For those watching online, you can send your questions to Twitter at Columbia U Energy, #CGEP events, Center on Global Energy Policy, and we'll pose those questions as well. Kim, hey.
Hi, thank you for that terrific presentation. I'm Kimberly Martin. I'm a professor at Barnard College, and I have two brief questions about the Russian oil industry technically. The first is, when we hear about service providers domestically having to make up for the absence of international service providers, assuming the sanctions are in place for long term, what is it that Russia has to do to develop a domestic service provider industry, and how difficult will it be for Russia to do that? The second technical question is there any chance that Rosneft would ever default on its international debt? And if so, what would the consequences be?
Questions?
Okay, so on the service industry, there is a significant service industry already, which provides a lot of the basic equipment that is used. And so you can drill a horizontal well and you can frack. But what it doesn't have, what it buys vast quantities of, is all the downhole sophisticated equipment used to optimize the outcome from the various wells. And to develop that technology would take a significant amount of time. So I think what we would see if sanctions remain in place or even get worse is a reversion to what we saw initially, in the Soviet era, which is a sort of make the best efforts, make do with less sophisticated equipment. And over time, the Russian service industry, it would be somewhat reinventing the wheel, but would be able to develop the technology, and it can buy it from China as well. It's not completely cut off. The Chinese market is open to it, and indeed, these things can be slipped in via the back door through Kazakhstan, etc. But essentially, over time, it could develop as sophisticated a business, but it would be a 5 to 10 year kind of process. In terms of Rosneft default, I think it's highly unlikely. It would be catastrophic. All plans for privatization of Rosneft would be out the window for time immemorial. And I think that given that there are these funds, there's $80 billion plus in the National Wealth Fund, there is a further $90 billion in the Stabilization Fund. Although allocation of that money is not meant for paying off external debt, I think ultimately it would receive government support if it got into serious trouble. So I think it's unlikely it would default.
Great. Next question.
Hi, my name is Natasha Udensova. I am a lecturer in Columbia.
Hi.
I have one comment and one question. A comment is that I think liquefaction technology actually is already a collateral of sanctions. To my knowledge, Yamal LNG has trouble of getting core technology in LNG right now, and one of the contracts with U.S. Major company is failing. So I think that's what's going on with the liquefaction technology. My question is, you mentioned a couple of times that Chinese pipeline is actually good for Russian budget. Well, I think I would argue actually this statement, because Chinese pipeline from the eastern or western Siberia, it doesn't matter, has been built yet, right? So there are a lot of billions of dollars, different amounts, like 50, 18, whatever it is. Gazprom doesn't have it. And it's not even clear what price has been negotiated with China. It seems like it's a huge state secret. Whatever price is, it's not accounting for the price of the construction. So the return of the investment will be very long, and it's considered like for 30 years. Plus, Gazprom is not going to pay tax to the state I think they were relieved from the paying tax from that for like nearest like 10 or 15 years. So it's not actually, the money is not coming to the budget, they're coming out of the budget.
Okay. Good point about Yamal LNG. I mean, there's certainly one of the questions is whether Air Products will be able to supply the liquefaction technology. At the moment, it's not embargoed, but as I mentioned, one of the psychological impacts of sanctions is that people are concerned and don't want to commit to contracts where they think the sanctions may limit their ability to trade in the future. So I'm not surprised to hear that Novatek are having those problems. On the Chinese pipeline, yeah, I mean, I see your point. Gazprom will struggle to raise the money, although Gazprom's debt profile is a lot better than Rosneft's and it's still generating free cash flow. In terms of the economics of the pipeline, my understanding from a number of sources is that the price, although I admit it's not been announced, is $10 an MMBTU, actually slightly below, at the Chinese border. And I agree again with you that the rate of return is marginal. My numbers suggest the rate of return is about 8% real, which is, if you were a commercial company, that would be a pretty disappointing rate of return. If you're a state company building a new piece of infrastructure that will be the foundation for your business in the Far East, then perhaps that's an acceptable rate of return on a utility kind of basis. So I think that there can be a return. Yes, the royalty tax has been removed, but as far as I can see, the export tax is still very much in place. So I think that can, once the project is on stream, 2020 or beyond, it can make a contribution to the Russian budget. Where will the money come from to finance the pipeline? Again, yes, there is a possibility that government support may be needed. My personal view is that as the negotiations continue, ultimately the Chinese will come up with some financing for one or other or both of the projects, even though it's been turned down at the moment. I think when we get down to the nitty-gritty of further negotiations over a second pipeline, we may find that Chinese financing becomes available. So it's a risk. I agree in the short term that Gazprom may not have the funds. I think overall in the longer term, it can benefit the Russian budget.
Great. Next question.
My name is Robert Silla, and I'm a private analyst, but I was wondering if you could speak a bit more about the Eastern Siberian agreement with China, because as far as I know, there's very little gas production there now, so it would seem that it would be quicker and cheaper for them to start shipping gas from Western Siberia to begin with. Also, it appears that the Chinese gas, because of the Russian gas, because of its price, could very negatively impact a lot of the LNG projects that are being talked about or being built now in Australia and in other areas. So it's actually quite a significant impact on supply and demand balances, even if one is natural gas and one is LNG.
Yes. So to take your questions in order. So East Siberian gas, yes, will need new field development. There are two fields which would need significant money spent on them over the next 5 to 7 years. But there's no link between West Siberian gas and the kind of northeast Chinese market. Even internally in Russia, there's no connection which could get West Siberian gas across there. Would it be more sensible to send gas by the western route first? Yes, it would, but China doesn't want to buy the gas there. So China wants to buy the gas in Northeast Asia, and it wants to buy it from East Siberia. Russia's been trying to sell the Western gas for the last 2 decades, and China's just said, no, we buy the gas from Turkmenistan. So if there's a Western agreement, it will be a second agreement, not a first one. But, yeah, certainly it makes sense for West Siberian gas to be sold into Western China. In terms of the price and the competition and LNG, I agree with you. I mean, I think that LNG and pipeline gas are the same thing. It's just transported by a different way. And so the price, what I think is happening in China is that China is establishing a benchmark price that it's prepared to pay for imports. And what has catalyzed that is the prospect of US LNG arriving at a Henry Hub price, based on a Henry Hub price of $4 to $5, and everyone's done the maths and has got to roughly $12 in Northeast Asia. And I think that's in the back of everyone's mind as they negotiate these deals, and I think it's no coincidence that if I'm right, and that the price at the Chinese border is $10 for Russian East Siberian gas, and that nets forward to $12.50 on the eastern seaboard, that's another example of a benchmark being set for an import price. And if you look at the Chinese domestic market, their current regulated price is $10.25. Then their price for new gas, if you're a customer who wants to buy to negotiate a new contract, that price goes up to $14. Again, we're seeing a range of gas price within China that sits around that $12 to $13 in the eastern seaboard. So yes, a benchmark price is being set. What does that mean for LNG? It means you're absolutely right that high-cost LNG projects are under pressure. Those that already have contracts clearly will be selling their gas at the low end of any take-or-pay agreement, if there is one. New high-cost projects, Canada, East Africa, will struggle unless they can match those kind of price levels. So yeah, it's certainly competition.
In point of fact, the Chinese are using the Russians to set a low benchmark for wherever they buy their energy. And there is a saying, my enemy's enemy is my friend. And what they're doing is they're politically latching on to the Russians and the Chinese are latching on to each other to bring pressure on the quote-unquote free world to control energy prices.
That is certainly one consequence of what's happened. I mean, absolutely. I think Russia needed to sell the gas politically because it wanted to demonstrate diversification away from Europe. China saw a fantastic opportunity to have a very strong bargaining position in the price negotiations, and it used it. And we found, if my numbers are right, we found a price that allows Russia to make an adequate but not exceptional rate of return. It allows China to set a benchmark price, and it allows a signal to go out to the LNG market. To be honest, I think one shouldn't be too Machiavellian about this. That signal had already gone out. Japanese buyers, Korean buyers, Chinese buyers, anyone who has had any interest in the US gas market and potential US LNG exports has been sending that message to producers anyway. I think what the Russian deal has done is reinforce that point, and so absolutely.
We have a couple of questions that have come in online of the people watching virtually. I'm not being rude and ignoring you and doing
No, it's all right.
One was what you think the prospects are for Rosneft to go back to the South Kara Sea next summer, given the sanctions, and can they do that without Exxon?
If I'm going to be definitive, I'd say there's no chance of them going back to South Kara Sea next summer. I think they don't have the expertise, and I'm pretty sure they've been cancelling the contracts for services, for support vessels, tugs, etc. And I'm pretty sure that the rig, the West Alpha rig, is being reallocated to other duties by Exxon. So I think there's a very, very low probability of them going back to the Arctic in the summer.
Okay. Did you have a question? Yeah.
My name is Max Pajor. I'm currently doing some work for the Energy Policy Research Foundation. In one of the things that you haven't mentioned is corruption, and you've done it in a sort of veiled fashion. These sanctions, the three sets of sanctions that you've had, first and foremost went against particular individuals within the Russian government, and those individuals who have strong controls over the in particular Igor Sechin, but other ones who have controls the hydrocarbon resource of Russia. One of the ways that it gets magnified, or it's illustrative, is the South Stream project. If you compare the cost, the headline cost that was just recently mentioned, $50 billion, for not that great of a distance, and you compare it to, say, something like the Keystone XL, you may argue that one's oil, one's gas, and you may be making an apples and oranges comparison, but Keystone XL, the headline number is $7.5 billion. So it looks like a hyper project for a way that you can move a considerable amount of funds offshore, not just pay for some white elephant infrastructure like you used. So I'd be interested in your comment on that. I think I had some other things, but that was one of the key points.
Okay, so the number of 50 billion is not just the offshore. Is not just offshore. The offshore number is about 18 billion, and the 50 billion covers the construction of the southern corridor in Russia, all the way from West Siberia down to the starting point for the offshore, and it also covers some of the onshore pipeline or Gazprom's share of the onshore pipeline in Bulgaria, and etc. So 50 billion is a big number, but the pipeline stretches basically from West Siberia to Baumgarten in Austria, so it's a hellishly long pipeline. However, that does not detract from your point about corruption, which is absolutely right, and pipeline construction has been one of the best ways of siphoning money off to friends of friends. Given we're online, I'm not going to mention any names, but so I agree that corruption plays a part in the decisions on pipeline construction. I think another point to make about South Stream is a lot of the money's already been spent. The southern corridor in Russia has essentially been finished, and Gazprom's already spent 5 billion on pipes, and the pipeline barge is already there. So I mean, there's a 2 billion pipeline contract which has already been, which Saipem will certainly sue for if they're not paid. So I think that some of the decision on South Stream diversion, it is interesting that what's happened is that it's almost as if someone was sitting with a map in the Kremlin and going, okay, we can't go there, so let's just go there instead. And the whole project has just swung south, which I don't actually think the whole of the pipeline will be. I don't think there'll be a 63 billion cubic metre pipeline, either to Bulgaria or to Turkey. I think it'll be probably half that, given the size of the markets. But nevertheless, absolutely, corruption plays a part. And it's one of the interesting questions about sanctions is that have they really impacted the people they were intended to impact? And on what reaction are we going to see if they have? And to date, all one can say is that it would appear that, yes, they have hit Timchenko, Gennady Timchenko, they have hit Igor Sechin, they have hit others because there's less money to go around. What reaction has that really caused? Well, to date, basically it's caused a rallying of the troops. It's caused a kind of macho mentality of I'm on the sanctions list, beating of chest, and that's kind of a badge of honor, and a kind of tightening of the clan. Now, as it carries on over 2, 3, 10 years, will there be a different reaction? Well, maybe. But in the short term, at least, it hasn't really had much impact, despite the fact there's less money to go around for doing the things that you were suggesting.
And how much collateral damage has there been on Western Europe, and what does that tell us about how much support there'll be for further tightening?
Well, I think the collateral damage on Western Europe has been limited to date, but I think the collateral damage on Europe, it'll be interesting to see going forward what happens if the decisions to diversify, particularly say from gas, take place. Because the bottom line is Russian gas is the cheapest gas available to Europe. So if you want security of supply, you've got to have to pay for it. And that's, for example, Lithuania has just built a floating regas terminal, and so is going to the global market to find an alternative to Russian gas. Now, it'll be interesting to see whether it can find a cheaper alternative to Russian gas or whether it can just use it as a bargaining tool. And I think that there's a possibility that countries in Southeast Europe, for example, may turn around and cause quite a fuss if there's a cut-off in Ukraine this winter, because countries like Bulgaria and Serbia and even Hungary don't see Russian gas as a security of supply risk. They see Ukraine as a transit risk. And so there's a difference of opinion now. So I think that the collateral damage could more be long-term, economic, and possibly even environmental if we continue to use cheap coal, because, if we want more gas, we're going to have to face the fact that, at the very least, we can't reduce our gas supply from Russia.
Does Europe want more gas, or has the security concern caused them to move away from
gas?
We're
in the middle of that debate, and there's no answer to that, because the environmental targets have been set, but many of them are non-binding. The Russian diversification strategy has been verbalized, but not kind of put down hard on paper. The contracts are already in place. Coal is being purchased. I mean, I was listening to a chap from France yesterday telling me that EDF is considering building a coal-fired power generation plant near Calais, so they can exploit cheap coal. And I'm being told by Spanish electricity producers that they don't envisage a scenario where they'll be running their gas-fired turbines for some considerable time and they'll be burning more coal as a backup for renewables. So I think the reality of the situation is that commercial organisations are taking commercial decisions, and they mean buying more coal and using less gas. At what point does the European Commission and European government say, sorry, that's got to stop, we're not there yet? But it'll take a big decision to make that happen, because it's not at the moment commercially rational.
We had another question from Twitter, which was what you think the timeline will be for a potential Western route.
That's a good question. I think it'll probably be something like the mid-2020s for first gas, if it happens. And I have to say, the Western route is by no means a certainty. The economics of it do make sense from both sides. Gazprom can make a similar return that it makes on its European sales. China can get competitive gas, certainly with Central Asian gas. There is the same issue about the spending on a pipeline. I mean, the pipeline will not be cheap, and the return on that pipeline will be relatively low. So there's still the question of the financing. But I think even in a benign scenario, we are talking even Gazprom are talking 2024.
Great. We have time for just one or two more questions. There was one over here. Yeah, please.
Thank you very much. Paolo Sorbello, energy analyst. I would like to bring you back to Central Asia a little bit and ask you whether the fact that Turkmenistan is shipping more and more gas to China and the revival of TAPI pipeline, how would that affect Turkmenistan's supplies to Europe through Russia? And if those are going to suffer, then is Russian gas going to be more valuable in that sense? Is Russia's domestic production going to be fulfilling the gap of that gas? Also, maybe in terms of prices, that could have a difference.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. So Turkmenistan has a strategy of selling gas at its border. So it doesn't physically transport any gas to customers. So Russia buys the gas and just puts it in its gas balance and balances it with its own production and the production of third parties in Russia. And its stated strategy is to stop that happening, because Turkmen gas is essentially priced at a European netback level. It's expensive relative to the cost of production of gas in Russia, and there is an oversupply in Russia already. So essentially Turkmen gas has become a kind of political tool to maintain links between Russia and the former Soviet states. And I think, again, another theme, which I mentioned in the presentation, was just this: the commercial reality is now trumping the politics. And Gazprom has stated it wants to reduce Turkmen imports to Russia to zero by 2020. So I think that Turkmenistan is developing a diversification strategy. China is a big part of that, and exports could rise to 65 billion cubic meters by 2020 if targets are met. So I don't think that the Turkmen gas not arriving in Russia will have much impact, to be honest, because it's already not having much impact. I think in terms of TAPI, that's an interesting option for Turkmenistan. There's clearly a lot of interest in it from foreign companies. I think the big issue with the TAPI pipeline is that any foreign companies, particularly US or European companies that might be involved, want equity in the upstream. They don't just want to build a pipeline. And I don't think Turkmenistan is going to grant them equity in Galkanish anytime soon. So I think the TAPI pipeline has some issues. But certainly, I think the problem for Turkmenistan is it's becoming overexposed to China. And there's clearly a foreign policy risk there.
Great. Last question.
Hi, my name is Nestle, and I'm from Oxford University School of Geography.
Oh, right.
My question is, so over the last 5 years, China's been a big supporter of, investing in renewables, and I'm sort of curious what you think if this new deal sort of with Russia is going to have an impact on that energy mix in terms of how much it invests in, for example, solar, wind, nuclear, et cetera.
So I think that China generally obviously wants to generate indigenous sources of supply to avoid security of supply risk, and clearly the security of supply risk both via pipelines and via sea lanes, where it sees kind of US dominance of the Pacific as a major supply risk. So I think renewables developments is certainly a theme. Will the Russian gas kind of import make a big difference? Gas is a pretty low share at the moment in the Chinese energy balance. It's down at like 5%, and they want to get it to 10% over the next kind of decade, realistically. So Russian gas plays a part in that shift from 5 to 10. But I think what we're really seeing is attempts to move away from coal and the environmental issues with burning as much coal as China does, and finding anything that is cleaner. And renewables is clearly part of that story. Gas is part of that story, but both will play a role by increasing their shares. And I don't think the interaction between the two will be that significant. So I don't think in any sense that buying Russian gas shows any decline in the appetite for renewables in China.
How serious is discussion about a pipeline to Japan?
It's it's something that Russia has wanted for some time, and certainly talking to Gazprom a couple of weeks ago in Moscow, they were pointing out the economics are very interesting. However, the political situation it's difficult. I think all the corporates involved think it's difficult to envisage a situation where the Japanese and Russian governments can get together, given their political disputes over the islands. Having said that, the other issue is that the gas from Sakhalin, which is the most likely pipeline, would arrive in northern Japan, and the gas is needed down in the south of the country. So I think there's, it's another part of the switch back to pipelines away from LNG. But if I was going to rank which pipelines are going to go ahead, the Japanese pipeline would be last at the end of the queue, I think.
Great. Well, this was a really interesting discussion, very timely. Sometimes we plan things on short notice. Next week, our next event will be at 10:30 a.m. in the Columbia Club in Midtown, where we'll be talking about the geopolitical and economic impacts of the recent oil price drop with Halima Croft from Barclays, Adrian Lejoux from the Center, Guillermo Mondino from Citigroup, Steve Sestanovich from the faculty here, and Mona Sutphin, former Deputy White House Chief of Staff and a partner at Macro Advisory Partners now. So we do things like that on short notice. Sometimes we get lucky where something that had been planned for a very long time turns out to be even more timely than we thought, like the discussion about what's happening in Russia today. So we're really delighted you were able to join us during your trip to New York. Please join me in thanking James Henderson.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
No worries, pleasure. Always interesting questions.